Today on Better Book Clubs, tips for reading The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. The Underground Railroad came out in 2016, and that year it won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. So this book was a big deal. It's also got some amazing blurbs on the front cover here. NPR calls it an American masterpiece. The Washington Post calls it a triumph. This is a book that comes highly recommended. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about some things that make this book a challenging book, which makes it a great choice for book clubs to read together. I want to just help you get started on a successful reading of The Underground Railroad. The trickiest thing I think about this book is how subtle it is. Colson Whitehead is playing around a little bit with metaphorical versus the literal pieces of the story. And you're going to notice it immediately when you discover that the Underground Railroad, which of course was a metaphor in reality, is made literal in Whitehead's story. There is literally a train in underground tunnels. And so you know when you read that, okay, so he's making this a little bit fantastical. He's playing around with the story a little bit. That should be a clue to you that there might be other times in the story as well where he's playing around with the literal and the figurative, and in some ways those two things mesh together. So if as you're reading, or I should say when as you're reading, you notice that something seems a little bit off or a little bit anachronistic or a little bit strange, trust your gut. Assume that you're right and start paying attention to what Whitehead is doing as he crafts this story. Another thing that makes this book challenging is the violence. You're reading a book about slavery, so you know that there are going to be emotionally challenging passages in this book. Expect it. But I think that the passages in this book that deal with violence are in some ways more troubling than passages that you may have read in other books about slavery, because Whitehead is a very good writer. He really brings these passages to life, not in a melodramatic way, which sometimes we get, partly because his protagonist, Cora, is very tough. She's very emotionally tough. And so we don't get her having some big emotional reaction to the things that are happening. The big emotional reaction is going to be on us. So that's something to know. It's not a reason not to read the book at all, but it is one of the things that makes this a challenging read. When you're discussing the Underground Railroad with your book club, at least in my opinion, the biggest question is whether what Whitehead is doing in this book works. He's playing around with literal and figurative. He has some anachronisms in here, some places where time seems to not be quite right. He's playing with different genres here. So he's telling the story and using some traditional genres in a particular way. And so if you can notice those things together, then the next question is, are they working? And I think that that's a legitimate question. I think that it's possible to argue that there are times in which what Whitehead is doing has the potential to undermine his project. Most critics say that they felt that what Whitehead is doing in the Underground Railroad really enhanced the story for them and made them feel the story more emotionally and more closely than they had before. But as I said, I think it's also possible to argue that the shifting and the playing that Whitehead is doing with this story could also have the opposite effect. And I think that one question of how well you think the story works could be a question that could occupy your book club for an entire hour-long discussion, because I think different people are going to see what Whitehead is doing differently. Different people might notice things. There may be passages that you find really powerful and other passages where you think maybe Whitehead has pushed his project too far. I think that Whitehead is certainly in classic territory here. I think this book is going to last. I think it's going to show up in high school and college curriculum in the future. And that in itself is a great reason to read it, because I think people are not going to stop talking about this book. And I think that it's going to continue to be a touchstone in fiction. I'll just read to you from the first page of The Underground Railroad to give you a flavor for Whitehead's writing. The first time Caesar approached Cora about running north, she said no. This was her grandmother talking. Cora's grandmother had never seen the ocean before that bright afternoon in the port of Uda, and the water dazzled after her time in the fort's dungeon. The dungeon stored them until the ships arrived. Dahomian raiders kidnapped the men first, then returned to her village the next moon for the women and children, marching them in chains to the sea 2 by 2. As she stared into the black doorway, Ajari thought she'd be reunited with her father down there in the dark. The survivors from her village told her that when her father couldn't keep the pace of the long march, the slavers stove in his head and left his body by the trail. Her mother had died years before. Cora's grandmother was sold a few times on the trek to the fort, passed between slavers for cowrie shells and glass beads. It was hard to say how much they paid for her in Uda, as she was part of a bulk purchase, 88 human souls, for 60 crates of rum and gunpowder, the price arrived upon after the standard haggling in Coast English. So you can see that Whitehead is starting his story right off the bat with a really powerful passage. You're going to find a lot of great passages of writing like that in The Underground Railroad. It's a great choice for your book club, and I hope you'll take it on together. If you're enjoying my videos, please remember to subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.